The Great Cryptid Hunt, Part 2, by Sean M. Gleeson. May 10th, 2022. It's hard to comprehend the horrors we encountered in North Dakota. It's even more difficult to understand that our world is full of creatures outside the confines of reality. When I set out on this assignment, I was looking to expose the illegal hunting of endangered species, bring justice to those who believed they were greater than the law. Now, it seems like a fool's errand. How can someone worry about such an insignificant matter? From a young age, I knew that the noises at night could be worked out with logic. A creaking in the attic, the house is still settling into its foundations. Shrill screams late at night, just some foxes calling to each other. The feeling that something's watching you as you turn off the lights and run upstairs. It's just your mind playing tricks on you. Hard to imagine a fully grown adult sprinting upstairs to his bed once the lights are off, but I have taken 3 steps at a time each night since. We left the forest when dawn broke. All 8 of us walked as if we were trailing a hearse. I suppose you could say we were. The team from base camp came and removed any evidence of the night before. The bodies of Ali, Levi, and Lucas were being transported ahead of us. Crane spoke to us beforehand, outlining the procedure that would occur if any of us were to perish during these trips. The Venators didn't stay hidden in the shadows by doing things half-assed. They had already arranged cover stories for each individual that was invited. The Sanders family, who had majority stake holdings in a big pharma company, had already given notice of their plans to retire to the Bahamas. Photos and title deeds of a property were already being doctored to embellish the story. We reached the camp and put our gear into the truck that would transport it to our next location. We were each given tickets for separate flights into Dublin Airport over the next few days. Once we landed, we would be picked up and travel to Galway. Recent sightings have indicated Banshee activity in a town called Athenry. Galway is known for its music, arts and stone walls, but we wouldn't be engaging in any of the local festivities. With my initial role in this operation no longer required, let alone worthwhile, I decided to continue with this group to document the paranormal creatures of the world. I arrived in Dublin and was met by Arthur. Arthur was one of the Venators who was with us in North Dakota. We had a few hours drive to Athenry, so we had time to kill. I asked Arthur about how he ended up being involved with Crane and the others. Arthur was an older man, his face showing signs of wrinkles. Judging by his tanned skin, he spent a lot of time working outside. Arthur told me how he used to farm back in the States. He was a dairy farmer who had took over the family farm when his father retired. His first encounter with the supernatural was on a trip to Argentina. His uncle was worried Arthur was missing out on seeing the world and looked after the farm while Arthur and his friend went on a 3-month trip across South America. Our last stop before heading home was in the northwestern region of Argentina. We were staying in a small village which lived off the surrounding farms. I was fascinated how they operated the farms by hand. With little to no machinery, they were able to produce so much. The night before we left, one of the locals asked us if we would help look into the disappearances of some goats. 2 had gone missing in the same number of days, and the village suspected some foul play. We set off into the evening in search, and stumbled across a petrified goat 2 fields over. The local lad started to get flustered and tried to head back to the village. I wasn't sure what to think. This goat was now solidified. When the shouting in Spanish began, I started to get a bit nervous. There was a rustling from a nearby bush, and we saw a large snake-like creature emerge. Its eyes burned brightly in the night sky. One of the guys went to step backwards away from the noise, but was petrified on the spot. "What did you do then?" I asked. I was still coming to terms with my first encounter with something I couldn't rationalise. "What else do you do?" Arthur said sheepishly. "I ran like the devil was on my heels. At the time, I was just fearful of my life. Even now, with over 10 years in this field, basilisks are not to be taken lightly." We arrived just after dusk. The moonlight illuminated the stonework of the castle walls. We pulled up outside and unloaded our bags. Arthur led the way through the gates. We entered into the castle grounds, lush with emerald green grass. The castle itself was quaint, not the majestic structure described in fantasy novels. It was built with a purpose and would be our base of operations. The keep itself was large and spacious. Crane was sitting in a camping chair, adding to the smoke from the open fire. The smell of burning kindling and cigarettes met us as we entered. "Ah, Mr. Marley, glad you could make it." The remaining members were setting up their beds or seeing to their gear. Caleb was sharpening a golden blade that caught the reflection of the flames. "That looks a bit fancy for hunting." I pointed to the ornamental-looking weapon he was inspecting. "A blade of pure gold is the only thing that can stop a Banshee." He handed me the blade. It felt heavy in my hand. I swung the blade in an arc, feeling the weight shift through the swing. "Not the most balanced weapon," I frowned. "That may be true," he smiled, pulling out his own from a sheath on his side. He slid the blade on top of his fingers to show the equilibrium close to the handle. "But it's priceless in this situation. Just make sure you don't hit anything other than the Banshee. This metal is too soft for standard use." I set up my sleeping bag next to Joshua and JJ. The latter was telling anyone who would listen about his extensive knowledge on Banshee folklore. "It is said that the Banshee is a symbol of death here in Ireland. She is also known as the Woman of the Fairies." I could tell his knowledge on the subject matter was limited to the top search of Google. "Her wailing is a foretelling of the death of a loved one. If you hear her call, a relative or someone close will perish that night," JJ announced. He held himself like a professor giving a lecture to an adoring class. "Good pair of earplugs should sort that problem." Crane tossed a plastic sealed bag to each of us in turn. "Put these on and get some rest. Tomorrow morning we are meeting with a family who have been plagued by the Banshee of Athenry for over a decade." After a hearty breakfast of sausage, egg and bacon, we set off into the town to meet with Brian and Emily O'Connor. They moved to Athenry nearly 30 years ago and settled into the community. Brian opened a pub soon after, and they started a family. There was obviously little to do in Athenry when they first moved, since they had 10 children in 20 years. Brian was a stout man with a warm smile and a belly fitting of a publican who regularly sampled his own products. His eyes told the truth, full of sorrow and sleepless nights. His wife was easier to read. The bags under her eyes weighed heavily upon her. A picture of all 12 of them hung on the chimney breast, showing a happy family enjoying the serenity of summer's eve in rural Ireland. That picture was taken not long before Fiona passed. Brian noticed I was studying the photo. Hard to believe there's only 4 of us now. The Banshee had taken the lives of 3 of their children before Brian had sought help from the local priest. He thought if he blessed the property, the lady in grey might move on. It wasn't until the next year that they heard her call again. We started wearing earplugs at night and leaving the radios on. Anything to drown out her wailing. We were broken, mentally and physically. I could tell she was still trying to claim more of my family. Some nights I would wake to goosebumps so intense they felt like stones on my skin. I knew she wasn't finished. We had only angered her more. We got through another year using these methods, but then one day I was opening the bar and I heard her. The next morning, Cillian didn't wake up. Crane put a supportive hand on the man's shoulder. We'll do what we can to rid you and your family of this deadly curse. Brian smiled weakly. God, I hope you do. If not, I'll have to take other precautions. He pointed to his right ear. It seemed to have been mutilated by some sharp object. It didn't take me long to realize the wound was self-inflicted. I was on edge for the day. Brian's words replayed in my mind. I thought of my family, my brother back home. One mistake and their lives could be in danger. Thousands of miles away, and they could be affected by my actions here in Ireland. Marco tried to lift the mood of the group. Look on the bright side. I could be the owner of a super yacht company in the morning. Caleb broke out into laughter that shook his very core, a bellowing guffaw that caught most of us off guard. Caleb was a quiet, serious man, so to see him like this lifted the mood of everyone, even me. Caleb was a mysterious individual. He was unassuming and introverted, but from what I seen during the encounter with the Wendigo, he was brave and well accustomed to these creatures of legend. I made a mental note to make an effort to sit down with him if we made it through tonight. As darkness began to swallow the evening glow, activity erupted throughout the castle keep. Right then, let's get down to brass tacks, Crane said, readying his pack. We'll need to split into 2 groups, one at the house and one circling the area. The group outside will need to try and force her in the direction of the house where the others can rush her with the blades. With a bit of luck, we can take her out with no casualties. Just remember, her scream is deadly, but she also will be dangerous up close. Banshees have a nasty set of nails that will cut through you like a hot knife through butter. Be on your toes, and for the love of God, keep your earplugs in at all times. He put emphasis on the last part. The group nodded in agreement, a sense of unrest evident in most faces. The groups were decided. Crane, Caleb, Antonio, and the 2 Williams would head out and surround the Banshee. Each one fitted with an earpiece that could receive communications from the transmitter here in the house. The rest of us would feed them information on where she appears tonight. I'm not ashamed to admit it, but the relief that washed over me when Crane said I was to stay at the house was overwhelming. I was already scared senseless and didn't fancy being on the front lines for this encounter. Lola seemed to have the same feeling. She visibly relaxed when the decision was made. Marco made a show of letting everyone know how disappointed he was at staying behind. I knew it was all bravado. The only one foolish enough to want to be out there was JJ. He was like a kid at Christmas. Oh, we're gonna get it good. He was talking to himself as he tightened the straps on his rucksack. Usually, a banishing spell would be used to get rid of a Banshee for a period of time, but tonight we're doing the opposite. Crane gathered the party at the door. Once you give me her position, I'll get to work on the trapping spell. Old Celtic stuff, but it works just as good. Once that's in place, things will get a bit ugly. She'll fight like the devil to get free, but we will force her back with some fire. He gestured to the wooden torches doused in fuel. They won't burn forever, so be ready to rush her from behind. The night wore on with little to no activity. Lola had volunteered to wear the last remaining earpiece to ensure transmission came through clearly. It was Michael's turn to be on watch, and he was standing on the front porch looking out across the moonlit land. I can't see anything out of the ordinary. It's a clear night, so I would expect to notice her by now. Brian and Emily were seated at the kitchen table. Emily seemed to be saying silent prayers with her rosary beads in hand. Brian took her hand and gave her a warm smile. It will all be over soon, he said reassuringly. She smiled back at him, but her face contorted into one full of terror. Brian turned to look at us. "She's here." I didn't need Brian to tell me what the shivers down my spine had already known. If my earplugs weren't in place, I would be hearing the wailing of a woman in the distance. Death was on the prowl tonight. Michael was scanning the landscape from the window of the kitchen, Marco accompanied with a compass in hand, waiting to give Lola the direction for the party outside. "I see her." Michael nearly dropped the binoculars. "She's perched at the base of a tree at the top of that hill." He pointed to Marco to check the compass. Lola relayed the info to Crane, and the hunt was on. We waited in silence for the signal torch to be lit. I released a breath I didn't know I was holding. The tension was insufferable. I felt helpless but also anxious about the part I had yet to play. All of a sudden, the goosebumps intensified, almost painful. My body was shaking as I tried to figure out what was going on. Crane's binding spell must have been effective. The Banshee was in survival mode. Lola seemed to be in agony, clutching her head and screaming soundlessly into my muted hearing. She reached for the earpiece and ripped it out, tossing it across the room. Before it struck the wall, the realization of what she had done overcame her. Marco rushed over to comfort her as she heaved from the sobbing. Tears were running down her cheeks as he wiped them away. In the commotion, we had taken our eyes off the events outside. Michael grabbed my arm and pulled me towards the door. As we exited the house, I could see the Banshee being forced towards us by Caleb and a flaming torch. I headed straight for the creature, brandishing my golden blade. Due to my lack of hearing, I wasn't aware of how loud my footsteps were as they pounded through the recently ploughed field. The Banshee was well aware though. As I closed the distance to the last few feet, she twisted to face me with inhuman speed. I lunged at her with everything I had, looking to drive the point of my blade through her chest. She knocked the blade out of my hands, sending it flying across the ground. Her next swipe was aimed at my head. I raised my arm to block the incoming blow, and her talons tore deep into my arm. I screamed in pain as the wound burned like acid tearing into my flesh. The force of the blow knocked me to the ground. She stood over me, eyes full of hatred, ready to claim her prey. JJ swung his torch into the creature's face. She screamed in anger, evident by the shock waves running over my skin. She retreated away from me, but JJ smelt victory. He pushed the burning stick at her again, but this time she met it with her own assault. The torch fell to the ground, along with a couple of his fingers. "No!" Joshua screamed. He flung his blade at the Banshee, hitting its true mark. The creature began to smoulder as she tried to finish off the bleeding JJ. A fresh wound opened across his chest as she disintegrated into embers of ash floating off in the night sky. "What happened back there? Where are the others?" Crane demanded. Michael explained what had happened back in the house. He was also able to tell us Lola had recently lost her father last year, her one remaining family member. The realization dawned on Caleb before any of us could understand the significance. "So, it will take Marco then," he said solemnly. Antonio looked as if he had seen a ghost. He went pale and dropped to his knees. He was taking the loss of his friend's life hard, even before it had come to pass. That night, we drank with the O'Connors, a strange mix of celebration and mourning. Marco had resigned to his fate and made it his mission to drink the family dry of whatever spirits they had in the cupboards. I found it very strange, emotions running wild like that of a wedding and a funeral all at once. Lola was inconsolable, rocking back and forward with her knees pulling up to her chest. Marco and Michael were giving their rendition of Bella Ciao at full volume. Antonio just sat there, frozen in thought. We settled Marco into one of the spare beds, one last night of comfort. The next morning, we all awoke, except one. Lola's screams woke all of us in a flurry of dazed and hungover heads, popping up from sleeping bags and couches alike. She would have given the Banshee a run for her money as she shook the lifeless corpse beside her. There was a crash as the doors to the bedroom slammed open. "Lola, what's the matter?" Marco asked, still drunk from the night before. He looked down on the body of his best friend, Antonio. "Antonio!" Marco was shaking his body furiously. "Wake up, man!" Lola's shrieking was escalating the situation. Marco had stopped shaking and had resorted to punching Antonio's lifeless corpse. Tears filled his eyes. "I always knew it," he said, looking at Lola. "You never loved me at all." He stood up and left through the back door, striking the wall with his fist, the dull crack as bone met cement. I had to step out after that. Emotions were sky high and my body was still recovering from the ordeal that was our encounter here in Ireland. I would have thought my tolerance to the supernatural entities of this world would have increased, but I was petrified for what lay ahead. Crane was already outside, puffing away on his morning cigarette. He lit one for me as I approached. I thanked him and took a deep drag. "And then there were 6, I said, as I exhaled the cloud of smoke off into the fresh, icy morning. I just want to thank Sean M. Gleeson for allowing me to narrate that story. If you liked what you heard, head over to their Reddit page and show them some love. I'll leave a link for the original story below. If you're new here, please consider subscribing, and as always, stay tuned for one more nightmare.